This video was made by Silent Company.
By the late 1930s, the world stood on a fault line. The First World War had ended 2 decades earlier, but its peace was fragile and unfinished. Empires had collapsed, borders were redrawn, millions were dead, and millions more were angry. Economic depression strangled nations, democracy appeared weak, and that uncertainty, new voices promised strength, order, and national rebirth. When the spark finally came, it did not ignite a single battlefield, it ignited the world. This is not merely another war. It was a global catastrophe that would consume continents, civilians, and soldiers alike. This is the story of World War II. The Treaty of Versailles ended the First World War, but it set the stage for the Second. Germany was stripped of its territory, military power, and pride. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Unemployment shattered society. Many Germans searched for someone to blame and someone to follow. Adolf Hitler offered both. By exploiting fear, nationalism, and resentment, the Nazi Party rose from obscurity to absolute power. Germany rearmed in open defiance of international law. Elsewhere, authoritarian regimes followed similar paths. In Italy, Benito Mussolini promised imperial glory. In Japan, military leaders sought resources and dominance across Asia. The League of Nations condemned aggression, but lacked the power to stop it. Appeasement replaced resistance, and the road to war lay open. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland along a vast front stretching from the Baltic coast to the Carpathian Mountains. Without a formal declaration of war, the attack began with a lie. German radio stations announced that Poland had provoked the conflict. In reality, the invasion had been planned for months. The assault was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. Columns of tanks surged forward, bypassing strong points and driving deep into Polish territory. Dive bombers screamed from the sky, striking railways, bridges, and command centers. Communication lines were severed almost immediately. Polish units found themselves isolated and unable to coordinate a coherent defense. Infantry followed close behind the armored spearheads, encircling the enemy formations and forcing rapid retreats. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, a new style of combat designed to paralyze an opponent before they could fully respond. Poland fought valiantly. Despite outdated equipment and a critical shortage of armor and aircraft, Polish soldiers resisted fiercely. Cavalry units did not charge at tanks blindly but were repeatedly outmatched by modern mechanized forces. Cities such as Warsaw endured relentless bombardment as civilians fled or took shelter amid the ruins. The Polish government had expected its allies to act. Britain and France pledged to defend Poland, but their armies remained largely inactive along Germany's western border. The promised relief never came. Then on September 17th, disaster struck from another direction. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, fulfilling the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a clandestine agreement between the Nazis and the USSR to divide Eastern Europe between them. Polish forces, already exhausted and outnumbered, now faced an attack from two totalitarian powers. Surrounded and betrayed, Poland collapsed. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th. Organized resistance ended soon after, though underground movements would continue to fight till the end of the war. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Europe was at war again. The Second World War had begun.
The following is a fictional part. It was inspired by the invasion. The morning the world ended didn't feel like the start of a war. It felt like any other late summer dawn, cold air, wet grass, and the quiet hum of insects waking up in the fields outside Wisna. I was 21, a conscript with a rifle older than I was, standing on a wooden watchtower that creaked every time I shifted my weight. Then the ground began to tremble. At first, I thought it was thunder. But thunder doesn't come in a steady rhythm. Thunder doesn't make the earth vibrate beneath your boots. I raised my binoculars, and that's when I saw them, black dots on the horizon, dozens of them, moving in formation. Tanks, more than I had ever imagined could exist in one place. Behind them, trucks. Behind the trucks, infantry. A whole world of steel rolling toward us. My throat went dry. "Panzer," I whispered, even though no one was close enough to hear. The sky changed next. A low drone, like a swarm of angry insects, grew louder and louder until it drowned out every other sound. I looked up and saw the silhouettes of Stukas cutting across the clouds, their wings angled like diving hawks. The siren started, that horrible rising scream that felt like it clawed straight into your chest. I froze. Everyone froze. Then the bombs fell. The first explosion hit the tree line behind us, sending a wave of heat and dirt across the trench. I ducked instinctively, my helmet ringing as debris clattered against it. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted orders I couldn't hear over the sirens. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to move. I slid down the ladder, boots hitting the ground hard, and sprinted toward my position. The air tasted like smoke and metal. The world shook with every impact. I could barely hear my own thoughts. When the Stukas finally pulled away, the tanks were already close, too close. Their engines growled like beasts, their tracks grinding the earth into mud. I raised my rifle, hands trembling, and fired at the lead tank, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. The bullet pinged harmlessly off the armor. The tank didn't even slow down. But we held. We fired until our barrels glowed. We threw grenades, shouted orders, dragged the wounded back behind the line. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like we might stop them. Then the artillery started. The sky flashed white. The ground erupted, and the world disappeared in smoke. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on my back, ears ringing, dust settling around me like snow. The tanks were still coming. The line was breaking. And I realized with a cold clarity I'll never forget that Poland was fighting for its life and losing. I pushed myself up, grabbed my rifle, and ran back toward the smoke. Because that's what you do when your country is burning. You run toward the fire, even if you know you can't put it out.
In the spring of 1940, Germany struck west with devastating speed. Using a revolutionary form of warfare known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war, German commanders abandoned the slow, grinding battles of the First World War. Instead, tanks punched through enemy lines, aircraft struck from above, and infantry followed close behind, all moving with terrifying coordination and pace. Entire fronts collapsed before the defenders could react. The campaign began in the north. Denmark fell in a single day, while Norway succumbed within weeks after fierce fighting. These victories secured Germany's access to vital iron ore supplies and gave the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe new air and naval bases, tightening Germany's grip on northern Europe. With Scandinavia under control, German forces turned toward Western Europe. In May 1940, they launched simultaneous invasions of Belgium and the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Dutch and Belgian forces resisted bravely, but they were quickly overwhelmed by relentless air attacks and advancing ground troops. Allied armies rushed toward to meet the enemy threat, believing that this was where the main German assault would be stopped. France, confident in its defenses, relied heavily on the Maginot Line, a vast network of concrete forts, bunkers, and artillery stretching along its eastern border. French planners believed that the dense Ardennes forest to the north was impassable to tanks, so it was lightly defended. But it was there where Germany decided to strike a decisive blow. German armored divisions surged through the Ardennes, crossing rivers and rough terrain once thought impossible for large forces. Emerging behind Allied lines, they drove deep into French territory, cutting off French and British armies from the south. The speed of the advance shattered communications and coordination. Entire units found themselves surrounded and forced to retreat or surrender. As chaos spread, the Allies mounted a desperate evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers escaped across the channel, but they left behind most of their equipment. France, exhausted and outmaneuvered, could no longer hold. By June 1940, German troops marched triumphantly through Paris. France surrendered soon after, ending one of the most stunning military campaigns in modern history. In just 6 weeks, a nation that had endured 4 years of war in the previous generation had been defeated, and the balance of power in Europe had shifted dramatically. With France and much of the continent under Nazi control, only one major opponent remained. Across the English Channel, Britain stood alone, facing uncertain future and looming threat of invasion. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. Across the Channel, Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. What happened next would not only decide Britain's fate but the fate of the entire world. The Royal Air Force, or RAF, was smaller in number. Its pilots flew Hurricanes and the faster, more agile Spitfires.
Had the Luftwaffe focused on destroying the RAF alone, rather than switching to focus on British cities as a reprisal for an inadvertent RAF raid, then the German dreams of a successful invasion may well have been realized. Britain remained
of 1940, the fighting began. German aircraft attacked shipping in the Channel and probed Britain's defenses. As August arrived, the Luftwaffe launched major attacks on airfields, aircraft factories, and radar stations. The pressure on the RAF pilots was relentless. RAF pilots came from Britain, the Commonwealth, and occupied Europe. While they were young, often barely trained, but determined. Pilots would be known as the Few. Polish pilots that escaped in 1939 also helped defend Britain. In September 1940, Germany changed tactics. Instead of focusing on the RAF airfields, they bombed British cities, including London. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the Luftwaffe failed to destroy the RAF. German pilots faced long flights, limited fuel, and increasing resistance. In October 1940, Germany postponed its invasion plans indefinitely. Britain had survived. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany. It proved that air power alone could be resisted, and determination could change the course of history. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the quiet fields of Eastern Europe erupted into fire. Without warning, Germany launched the largest military invasion the world has ever seen. 3 million soldiers, over 3,000 tanks, and more than 2,000 aircraft. The target was the Soviet Union, a nation which Hitler believed could be crushed in a matter of months. The operation was given a single name: Barbarossa. At 3:15 in the morning, German artillery opened fire across a 1,800-mile front. Moments later, Luftwaffe bombers roared across the border, striking Soviet airfields before most pilots even knew the war had begun. Within hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Communication lines collapsed. Entire divisions were cut off before they could even mobilize. The Red Army, still recovering from Stalin's purges, was thrown into chaos. The German plan was simple and brutal. 3 massive army groups would drive deep into Soviet territory. Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, Army Group South towards Ukraine and the oil fields beyond. The speed of the assault stunned Soviet commanders. German panzers sliced through defenses, encircling entire armies in days. At Minsk and Smolensk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded. Many fought to the last bullet. Many more were taken prisoner. Despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union refused to collapse. Factories were dismantled and moved east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Fresh divisions were raised. Civilians dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared for siege. The Red Army was battered, but not broken. By autumn, German forces were exhausted. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Fuel and ammunition ran low, and the weather began to turn. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Tanks bogged down. Trucks sank axle deep. Progress slowed to a crawl. Then came winter. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, weapons jammed. German troops wearing summer uniforms suffered terribly. Meanwhile, the fresh Soviet reinforcements, many from Siberia, arrived to defend Moscow. In December of 1941, as German forces stood just miles from the Soviet capital, the Red Army launched a massive counterattack. Soviet infantry, tanks, and cavalry pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. For the first time in the war, Blitzkrieg had failed. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion Hitler believed would end in weeks, had stalled, and the Eastern Front was about to become the bloodiest battlefield in human history. By 1941, Japan stood at a crossroads. For years, the Japanese Empire had expanded across Asia, waging a brutal war in China and seeking dominance in the Pacific. But the expansion came at a cost. A world was beginning to push back. Japan's war machine depended on resources it did not possess: oil, steel, rubber. Much of it came from the United States. When Japan refused to halt its expansion, the U.S. responded with economic sanctions. Then came the oil embargo. Overnight, Japan lost access to nearly all of its oil supply. Military planners calculated they had less than 2 years before their fuel reserves ran dry. Japan now faced a choice: retreat or strike. Japan's leaders chose war. Their plan was bold and dangerous. If they could cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow, they believed America would be too weakened and too unwilling to fight a long war across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor was the key, home to America's battleships and aircraft carriers. It represented U.S. power in the Pacific. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft filled the skies over Hawaii. The attack was sudden, coordinating, and relentless. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, thousands were killed or wounded. But the strike failed to achieve its ultimate goal. America's aircraft carriers were at sea. Fuel depots and repair facilities remained intact. Instead of breaking American resolve, the attack did the opposite. The United States entered the war, united, enraged, and determined. Japan hoped for a short war. Instead, it had awakened an industrial giant. The path to total war had been set. Six months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was still reeling. Japan had swept across the Pacific, capturing territory from Hong Kong to the Philippines. But in June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy set its sights on a small isolated atoll in the middle of the ocean, Midway. Japan believed destroying the remaining American carriers would end U.S. resistance for good. Instead, that would become the turning point in the Pacific War. Japan launched a massive fleet: 4 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and over 200 aircraft. Their goal was to lure the U.S. into a trap, but the trap had already been broken. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese communications. The U.S. knew the target, they knew the date, and they were waiting. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft attacked Midway Island, blasting runways and fuel tanks. But as they returned to their carriers, American planes were already in the air. The first U.S. attacks were disastrous. Torpedo squadrons flew low and slow, but were cut down almost to the last man. But their sacrifice forced Japanese fighters out of position and left the carriers exposed. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. With enemy decks crowded with refueling aircraft and armed bombs, the moment was perfect. In minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit, engulfed in flames, and doomed. Later in the afternoon, the final carrier, the Hiryu, was sunk and destroyed. Japan had lost all 4 of its frontline carriers. By the summer of 1942, the war in the East had become a struggle of exhaustion. Germany, desperate for oil and a decisive victory, turned toward a single name on the map: Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River, a symbol of the Soviet resistance, and the gateway to the Caucasus. Hitler believed by taking Stalingrad he would break the Soviet Union's spirit. Instead, it would break the German army. In August, the Luftwaffe
unleashed one of the most destructive bombing campaigns of the war. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in days, but the ruins did not weaken the defenders. It strengthened them. As German infantry poured into the city, they found themselves fighting block to block, building to building, and room to room, inch to inch. Factories became fortresses, sewers became tunnels, every street was a battlefield. The Soviets called it the City of Death, the Germans called it the Furnace. The Red Army clung on to the west bank of the Volga with everything they had. Reinforcements crossed the river under constant fire, often arriving with no rifles, no helmets, just to hold the line. Snipers hunted through the shattered windows, machine gun nests hid in collapsed stairwells. Grenades were thrown across hallways instead of trenches. The fighting was so close, so brutal, that soldiers described it as the Rat War. By November, the German Sixth Army was exhausted, stretched thin, and freezing. Their flanks, held by a weaker Romanian and Italian units, were vulnerable. The Soviets struck there first. On November 9th, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer attack north and south of the city. Within days, the jaws closed behind Stalingrad. The entire German Sixth Army, over 2,500 men, was encircled, cut off from supplies, starving and freezing. Temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, and the German soldiers held out as long as they could. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man, but the Soviets tightened the noose. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was in ruins. On February 2nd, the last pockets of resistance surrendered. Stalingrad was over. During all this conflict in Europe and in the Pacific, Africa has also been at war. By the winter of 1940, the war had spread beyond Europe. Across the deserts of Libya and Egypt, a new front was taking shape, a battlefield of sand, heat, and endless horizon. Britain fought to hold the Suez Canal, Italy fought to claim an empire, and soon Germany would spend one of its most famous commanders to turn the tide, Rommel, the Desert Fox. What began as a small colonial struggle would become a clash of nations, stretching from the Mediterranean coast and to the burning deserts of the Sahara. In early 1941, Rommel arrived with the Afrika Korps. Fast, aggressive, relentless, he struck before the British could recover, driving them back hundreds of miles with a whirlwind of armored assaults. Chibok became a fortress, a symbol of resistance, a thorn in Rommel's side. For months, the garrison held out under constant bombardment. Surrounded but unbroken, the desert became a battlefield unlike any other. Tanks fought across open plains with no cover. Engines choked on sand. Water was more precious than ammunition, and soldiers marched under a sun that killed as surely as any bullet. Both sides learned the same brutal lesson. The desert was a very bad place to fight. By 1942, the momentum shifted again. Rommel pushed deep into Egypt, reaching a small railway called El Amin, the last barrier before the Nile. But here the British dug in. Here they refused to yield another inch. Under General Montgomery, the Allies rebuilt, reorganized, and prepared for a decisive stand. When the battle began, the desert lit up with artillery fire, so bright that it turned the night into day. Minefields stretched for miles. Tanks clashed at point-blank range. Infantry fought through dust storms and smoke so thick they could barely see the man beside them. Slowly, relentlessly, the Axis line began to crack. By November, Rommel's army was exhausted, starved of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. The British stuck with overwhelming force, breaking through the Afrika Corps and driving them west. They retreated, became a collapse. The collapse became a rout. And then American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. The Axis position in Africa was doomed. By May 1943, the last German and Italian troops surrendered. The North Africa was over. The campaign fought across thousands of miles of desert ended in Allied victory, and opened the door to invasion of Italy, and push toward Europe's heart. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had stretched to a breaking point. The Soviet Union was pushing west. The Allies controlled the skies, and Hitler's empire was beginning to fracture under the weight of a global war. But the end of the conflict, the Western Allies needed one thing above all: a foothold in Europe, a way back into the continent, a door into Hitler's fortress. That door was Normandy. For months, the Allies prepared in silence. An army of more than 2 million men gathered in Britain. Factories worked day and night, ships filled entire harbors, and in the shadows, deception operations misled the Germans into guarding the wrong coast. Then, in the early hours of June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Paratroopers dropped into darkness scattered across the French countryside. Some landed in fields, some landed in marshes, some directly into enemy fire. But they sieged bridges, crossroads, and villages, shaping the battlefield before dawn. At first light, the sea itself seemed to move. Thousands of ships stretched across the horizon, the largest armada in human history. Toward the beaches of the landing craft advanced. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, names that would be carved into history. As the ramps dropped, the world erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the surf. Mortar shells crashed into the sand. Men waded through the waters, stained with smoke and steel, pushing forward inch by inch. On Omaha Beach, the resistance was brutal. Units were pinned down, casualties mounted. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. But slowly, relentlessly, the tide turned. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Infantry scaled the bluffs. Tanks crawled their way ashore, and by midday the German defenses began to crack. Behind them, wave after wave of reinforcements landed. Ahead of them, the road to France laid open. By nightfall, the Allies secured a foothold. Not a large, not perfect, but enough. Enough to break the Western Front, enough to bring enough to begin liberation of Europe, enough to start the final march toward Berlin. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was starting to close. Germany was surrounded on all sides. The Western Allies pushed in from France. The Soviets pushed in from the east. Deep inside the Reich, in the capital, Berlin, braced for the final blow. For Hitler, Berlin was more than a city. It was the heart of his empire, a symbol of power, a fortress he believed it could still be saved, but the armies were closing in told a different story. In April, the Red Army reached the outskirts of the capital. What follows was the most intense urban battles of the war. Artillery pounded the city day and night, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Streets became trenches, buildings became strong points. Every intersection was a kill zone. Soviet tanks pushed through barricades, debris, and twisted metal. Infantry fought room to room, floor to floor, as German defenders, soldiers, police, and hastily armed civilians tried desperately to hold back the inevitable. The fighting was brutal, close, chaotic. Berlin burned as the Red Army advanced block by block toward the city center. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler issued the orders that no one could follow. His armies only existed on maps. His divisions were shattered. His allies were gone. And reality had closed in on him. On April 30th, as Soviet troops closed within a few hundred meters, Hitler committed self-death beneath the ruins of his capital. Above the ground, the battle raged on. On May 2nd, the last German defenders in Berlin surrendered. The red flag was raised over Reichstag, a symbol that the war in Europe was ending. Days later, Germany surrendered. The Third Reich was gone, and from the ruins of Berlin, a new world would begin to take shape. By late 1943, the war in the Pacific had become a battle of distance. Thousands of miles of open ocean, hundreds of islands fortified by the Japanese Empire, and every step forward came at a terrible cost. The United States adopted a new strategy, island hopping, leapfrogging across the Pacific, capturing key islands and cutting off others, pushing even closer to the Japanese home islands. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Palau, each name became a battlefield. Each battlefield became a graveyard. The fighting was brutal, close, and unforgiving. Japanese defenders fought from caves, tunnels, and bunkers carved into the earth. Surrender was rare. Every island had to be taken by force. By early 1945, only two barriers remained between the United States and the Japanese home islands: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. On Iwo Jima, the volcanic ash swallowed boots and blood alike. The island was a fortress, a maze of tunnels and hidden gun positions. For 5 weeks, Marines fought yard by yard, raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi as the battle raged on below. Then came Okinawa, the largest, bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Rain turned hills into rivers of mud. Kamikaze attacks filled the sky with fire, not the fire with sky. What does that even mean? Anyway, civilians were caught between two armies, their lives shattered by war. They could not escape. By June, Okinawa was in American hands, but the cost was staggering. On the road to Japan promised even worse. Faced with the prospect of an invasion that could kill millions, the United States made a decision that would change the world forever. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities vanished in moments. The scale and destruction was unlike anything humanity had seen before. Days later, Japan surrendered. The war was over. From the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin, from the desert of North Africa to the Pacific Islands, World War II consumed the world. Tens of millions were dead, nations were shattered, and the world had emerged from the ashes would never be the same. Thank you for watching.